The film follows the story of a man named Pardo who is a strict believer of God and attends church very punctually. One day, Pardo gets to witness a strange activity going on in the church as he walks in. He sees from afar a panicked and nervous person who was placing something in one of the church's flower pots. Finding this act suspicious, Pardo decides to go after the stranger to the harbor. As he stalks the stranger, he sees that the stranger gets approached by 4 other men who happen to be in search of a bag of cash. The men use their fearsome techniques to get a word out of the stranger, but when the stranger appears confused and fails to tell where the bag of cash is, the men grab him and submerge him in the water by the sea. When the men fail to get the information out of him, they decide to leave him. Pardo finally approaches the man who looks in misery. After their conversation, Pardo decides to help Agustin, who insists on taking him to his friend Antonia's house. Upon arriving at Antonia's house, they are nicely welcomed by Antonia. Things become unfortunate for Antonia when she sees Agustin's miserable condition. She decides to send away his son to his aunt's place. Despite her son being sick and in need of medical assistance, Antonia takes one for the team and decides to help them. Before that, she has to send her son away since having Agustin in her house like that can be dangerous. Pardo becomes curious and asks Agustin about what is going on. Instead of addressing the situation, he requests Pardo to help him get those people off his back that are constantly bothering him and not letting him continue his work in peace. Pardo thinks for a while before taking any decision in Agustin's will. When Pardo gets to his house, he performs a ritual that involves playing Russian roulette with the gun's bullet holes. He shoots through one hole while leaving the other 5 unfilled. Then he lets off one shot at his head with the gun. It is his way of deciding if he is still granted the opportunity to survive. He acquires the title of the Redeemer. In the next scene, Pardo is seen arriving at the harbor and challenging the 4 attackers who had tortured Agustin in the beginning. Agustin is likewise terrified as he observes Pardo from a distance. The fight turns into a bloodbath when Pardo slits open his opponent's throat with a little knife that is tucked into his finger. Another one of the bad guys gets his head crushed by a boat engine's propeller. Pardo takes the possessions of those 4 bad guys and gives them to the church after winning the battle. Pardo then moves in the direction of Antonia's home. On his way, he notices a large group of armed men lounging about closer to the highway. Even though they ignore him, he becomes alarmed and starts acting casually in front of them, showing that he is not the guy they are searching for. When Agustin gets to Antonia's house, he begs Pardo to shield him from the attackers. He finally reveals that a drug dealer boss owns the bag that Agustin threw away a few days earlier that contained the money, and now a lot of people are after him. Pardo takes notice of the situation and decides to help and guard Agustin as long as the money is given back to its rightful owner. At this point, any decision that Pardo takes is acceptable to Agustin since he desperately needs protection from the mafia world, so he bluntly accepts Pardo's suggestion. Subsequently, Pardo drives Agustin and Antonia to a cave on a lonely beach, which happens to be a good hideout from drug dealer gangs for some time. Following that, Pardo enters a gang of narcotics dealers. He offers to reveal the location of the bag they are seeking in exchange for them leaving the city along with the cash bag so that Agustin can come out of the hideout. Their boss Piedra doesn't buy Pardo's words and demands Pardo show them any evidence or give them a hint somehow. Since Pardo has no hard proof, he holds the bad guys at gunpoint and makes up a lie, saying that the bag they're seeking is concealed in a church. Piedra heads straight to the church with his thugs. His men scratch the surface and looked at every corner, but they are unable to locate the bag. Piedra, who is furious, calls his thugs who are guarding the facility where Pardo is being detained by them. He gives the order to execute Pardo for lying. Pardo attacks Piedra's men fiercely. He faces off against numerous armed henchmen of Piedra alone. Fortunately, Pardo overcomes the conflict and slays all the men that were trying to detain him. Piedra soon makes his way back home. He is beyond shock to see all of his guards deceased. He quickly informs Steve, his superior, of Pardo's escape. As the plot reveals itself, it is shown that Steve is the owner of that bag. After escaping from Piedra's detention, Pardo enters the cave to find Agustin and Antonia, who appear to be busy counting money. The bag Piedra was seeking has been taken back by Agustin so that Antonia can cure his son. He tries to grab the bag, but Antonia begs Pardo to give her the money and attempts to stop him. Pardo disregards it and takes the bag anyway. He still intends to give Piedra the money back. As he leaves in his vehicle, he becomes puzzled by the situation because Antonia's case also seems desperate and important. However, he looks back into the past when he had a beautiful wife and a kid. He takes his final decision, which is to go back to the cave and give Antonia and Agustin their money. He plays Russian roulette as part of his special routine while remaining in the cave. Fortunately, the bullet that fires is empty, saving his life. Later, Pardo starts directing the criminal activities of drug dealer groups. He keeps tabs on every facet of the group's operations until he one day follows a car that leads to a drug manufacturing facility. He continues to observe what is happening there from a distance. He gets into his automobile and follows the car he had been following out of the factory. It turns out that he was caught in a trap, which was unexpected. He tries to escape in his vehicle, but thugs open their fire at his car as it crosses a road that leads to a warehouse. He stops and engages in combat with a narcotics gang member here. Pardo is having a difficult time beating his opponent because he happens to be stronger than him. He eventually succeeds in knocking his opponent to the ground, who eventually dies when Pardo strikes him with a deadly kick. He goes back to the cave that night to sleep. Antonia shows up and extends a conversation invitation. As Antonia touches his back, he recalls the time when his wife was abducted during her pregnancy and was tortured by a Don named Alacran. Pardo was given the option of either taking his wife's life or seeing her be tortured to death. Pardo felt powerless at that moment since he was a slave of Alacran. He was given a gun that was pointed at the body of his wife. He was pressured into shooting his wife because he couldn't stand to see her suffer any longer. Returning to the present, Pardo is shown getting into his car and heading back to the drug dealer's office. Meanwhile, Augustin attempts to steal his boat, which is tied at the edge of the harbor. He plans to flee the city using the boat. Unfortunately, Alacran's soldiers catch him as soon as he gets on the boat. To avoid the thugs, he dives back into the ocean and tries to get back into the cave, thinking he would be safe there. He gets out of moods when he sees Alacran waiting for him in the cave's opening. On the contrary, Pardo moves toward a narcotics factory carrying a gun. He fearlessly enters the factory while firing at the gate's guards. A furious gunfight breaks out. He runs into one of the guards in a chamber and engages him in combat using only his hands. After several hits, his opponent is successfully overturned. Pardo then makes his way upstairs where the mafia boss office is. Bullets have been scattered around the floor of the cluttered room. He moves toward the mafia boss, who is seated in a chair. As he walks closer to the mafia boss, Alacran shows up from behind and strikes his head very hard. When Pardo passes out, he recalls his past with Alacran, who was once his biggest enemy. Pardo once had a job that was against the law. He is a murderer. He is then paid to murder Alacran in his residence. However, Pardo makes a mistake because Alacran is challenging to defeat. Alacran's son unexpectedly emerges from his room sprinting during the melee. He shoots a bullet that strikes Alacran's son. Alacran loses his cool after witnessing the death of his one and only son. Pardo finally wakes up and finds himself in front of the beachside church. He observes Augustin and Antonia sitting in terror. Alacran orders Augustin to shoot himself in the head while pointing a gun at him. Alacran shoots one of Antonia's legs in response to her terrified screams. Augustin tries to aim the gun he just pulled out to fire at Alacran, but Alacran notices it right away, and in a split second, he shoots Augustin in the head. Alacran then requests that Antonia take the weapon that Augustin is holding. She raises the weapon to her head. Pardo, meanwhile, is reminded of his wife as he observes the turmoil in front of him. With little power left in her, Antonia abruptly points the gun she is holding toward Alacran. Pardo, meanwhile, kicks Alacran's gun and flings it away from his reach. The two then engage in one-on-one combat in front of the church using only their bare fists. Both of them are skilled fighters, so their fight is evenly matched. After getting a tough time from Alacran, Pardo finally gets the upper hand and beats Alacran. In the end, Alacran becomes powerless but still alive. Pardo goes against his will and decides to not slay Alacran. Pardo counsels Alacran to turn from his sin and emulate him in battling crime, which brings the film to an end. Subscribe to see more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.